Today's story is one of entrenchments, failed political intelligence, failed surveillance intelligence, and some HIMARS to boot. As Ukraine's Kursk offensive into Russian territory completes its first week, it is becoming clearer that there are serious structural problems with Moscow's preparations for such a gambit. In turn, a natural question to ask is how this could have possibly happened. Now, it is far, far too early to be writing the history books on this one. After all, Ukraine's offensive continues, with blue and yellow soldiers still pushing in new directions, even if at a slower pace. Nevertheless, the signs point to two clear contributing factors that help explain why Russian defenses failed to immediately stop Ukraine's invasion. What we are observing is a significant failure on the part of Russian intelligence. And to make the problem worse for the Kremlin, it is not just one segment of its intelligence apparatus at fault. No, this required the combined failures of what we might call political intelligence, that is, the ability to deduce what your opponents are politically willing or unwilling to do, and surveillance intelligence, that is, the ability to cut through the fog of war and see what is actually happening out there in the world. In short, Russia failed to understand that Ukraine had the political ability to conduct the Kursk offensive, and it failed to observe the actions that might have otherwise mitigated the damage from the first failure. The result is an invasion of Russian territory for the first time since World War II, and the potential for a political crisis in Moscow. But the full story is inevitably a little more complicated. Today's puzzle will have 4 pieces. The constraints on Russian manpower that created the dilemmas that follow, the underlying problems that led to Moscow underestimating Ukraine's political will, how frontline defenses are supposed to work in this type of situation, and how surveillance intelligence failed to allow that system to function as intended. But we begin with the primary constraint that the Kremlin faces: manpower. There seems to be a myth that Russia has an unlimited pool of humanity to throw at the war. But the myth that it is, that belief is misleading. Yes, if this were a fantasy draft, and you had to pick either Ukraine's or Russia's populations, without any other considerations, you would be crazy not to go with the bear team. But executing a war plan requires both the baseline resource and the political will to tap it. And it is the latter that has befuddled Moscow for almost 2 years. September 2022's mobilization was done out of a military emergency, with Ukraine pushing Russian troops out of the Kharkiv region, and Russia well short of the men needed to defend the front line. But the Kremlin received a clear message in the mobilization's aftermath: do it again at the regime's peril. Since a young Vladimir Putin came to power, Russia's implicit social contract has dictated that the politically powerful populations in Moscow and St. Petersburg will be left alone, and, in exchange, the Kremlin could do what it wanted to do with its foreign policy. The special military operation was to continue in that tradition, but mobilization broke it. Those fortunate few with the necessary means fled the country, to places like Turkey and the United Arab Emirates, and Russia's per capita conscription ultimately tilted away from the country's empowered western regions. Indeed, the blowback and response signaled a deeper transition. In the absence of compelled service, Russia shifted to voluntary contracts. Although more politically expedient, the problem with voluntary contracts is that, despite the name, the individuals are not volunteers. You actually have to pay them. And, increasingly, you have to pay them a lot. Now, it is easy to take a casual look at the Russian economy and conclude that the country is undergoing a boom period. After all, GDP was up in 2023 by 3.6%, despite the war. The trouble is that despite is not the right descriptor. Because of is more accurate. To explain what is happening here, and at the risk of sabotaging my viewer retention, we need to talk macroeconomics for a moment. GDP pretends to be the almighty metric of a country's economic health. But what is it really? Well, its formula is consumption plus investment plus net exports plus government spending. How does this work out for Russia? Western sanctions have pounded net exports, but government spending has accelerated to extreme levels to produce everything for the war. Hence, Russian GDP is up, even as better indicators, like the 9.1% official inflation rate or 18% central bank interest rate, paint a far grimmer picture. Cognizant of this, Ukraine has attempted to hit the highest value targets possible, hammering refineries and attempting to bankrupt the Russian energy industry. Consequently, Moscow has needed to show some judiciousness in its recruiting, despite Russia's dominant population size. Now, that may not last forever, and the Kursk incursion conceivably will change Moscow's calculus. However, at least for almost the last 2 years, the Kremlin has leaned more toward regime survival than maximizing effectiveness in the war. That takes us to the Kremlin's first intelligence failure. Well, more precisely, the first intelligence failure of the current situation. The first intelligence failure occurred back in February 2022, but that is a 40-minute story for another video. Constrained by money, and thus constrained on manpower, the Kremlin still had to decide how to allocate its troops on 2 fronts. First, its offensive in eastern Ukraine, and second, defense along its border. Obviously, the Kremlin wanted to shift as many resources into eastern Ukraine as possible. Yes, in sports, defense may win championships, but over in Russian-occupied Ukraine, it certainly was not going to yield massive territorial gains. Now, why further expansion in Ukraine was a priority for the Kremlin remains an open question. Perhaps Russian strategists calculated that Ukraine was vulnerable there, which may still be the case. To wit, Russia has made steady gains there, even if they have come at an astonishingly high human price. On the other hand, perhaps these gains are more of a political necessity, that the regime will be in danger if it cannot at least cobble together all of the Luhansk and Donetsk oblasts. Either way, every Russian soldier stationed to the north was one fewer human working toward that goal. Thus, the Kremlin had to ask itself what was the fewest number of soldiers it could place along the border. Answering that required thinking about what the chances were that Ukraine might take such an action. 3 pieces of information appeared to be telling in that regard. First is that, for all of the problems that Russia was having with manpower, Ukraine seemed to be having it worse. In contrast to Russia, this was less of a political problem. Basically, everyone in Ukraine is directly affected by the war in some way, and more of a sheer numbers problem. Ukraine's population is less than 30% of Russia's, and the lack of babies following the fall of the Soviet Union was doing it no favors. That all suggested that Ukraine could not try a border incursion without damaging its position along the eastern defensive perimeter. Second was prior raids. Earlier incursions demonstrated that leaving the border completely undefended would be a bad idea. Back to the map. This is Kursk, where the current offensive is. But we need to rewind to May 2023 and head slightly southeast to Belgorod. That month, Russian dissidents staged attacks there, with logistical support from Ukraine. A handful of other similar but smaller incursions also occurred that year. The key point, though, is that the underlying intent in these cases was harassment. The groups wanted to raise their public profiles, and Ukraine was happy to provide support just to irk the Kremlin. At no point were they capable of meaningfully penetrating into Russia, never mind holding territory. They were there to hit easy targets and run away, nothing more. Third, and connected to the second, was U.S. reluctance to support attacks inside of Russia. Washington is a major supplier of Ukrainian arms, but has been reluctant to approve of U.S. weapons use in Russia, and has outright criticized measures like attacking refineries. This reflects concerns in Washington that escalation in this manner invites some type of reaction from Russia. And even putting aside the nuclear rhetoric that the United States might not have believed, this concern was reasonable. Russia was already engaging in lethal covert actions connected to the war. Consequently, think about the Kremlin's perspective here. An outright invasion of Russia, with authentic Ukrainian boots on the ground, would have only frustrated the Biden administration even more, or so it would have seemed. And if Ukraine used American-supplied weapons, well, surely that would have had to have been unacceptable to the White House, right? This, of course, is all speculation regarding an unclear situation. But consider what Russian intelligence would infer from all of this. Would it be safe to leave the border completely undefended? Almost certainly not, given that there were previous incursions. But does border security need to prepare for multiple brigades of Ukrainian soldiers, armed to the hilt with Uncle Sam's party supplies? Sure, it is a possibility, but not something that you need to bank on. From the perspective of someone on August 1st, 2024, the most likely thing to happen was more of those small raids. Okay, let's pause here for a second and do something weird. I want to work on a puzzle that often vexes my students who are new to game theory. Suppose that to stop a Ukrainian attack, Russia needs 10 troops per kilometer of border to halt a full-on invasion, 2 troops per kilometer of border to stop the small raids, and none if nothing is going to happen. To make things easy, you automatically succeed if above the corresponding threshold, and automatically fail otherwise. Further, your intelligence organization is telling you that there is a 24% chance that there will be an invasion, a 75% chance that there will be a small raid, and a 1% chance that there will be nothing. Given all of that, how should Russia go about choosing how many to deploy, remembering that each soldier on the border is one fewer fighting in Ukraine? Well, the trap that new students sometimes fall into is averaging out the threat. That is, they want to weigh the number of necessary soldiers by the relative likelihood of each potential threat, and then choose the corresponding average. Here, that would be 10 times 0.24, plus 2 times 0.75, plus 0 times 0.01, which works out to be 3.9 soldiers per kilometer. It seems like a reasonable course of action, and it is mathematically literate. But one problem. It is a bad way to work through the strategy. When potential threats fall under distinct categories like these, the average does not matter. What does is whether the next soldier deployed is pivotal to victory. Remember, anything less than 2 stops nothing, and anything between 2 and 10 only stops small raids. When you have 3.9 soldiers per kilometer out there, well, first of all, pity the 1 soldier per kilometer who is missing 10% of his body. But second, you either have 1.9 too many or 6.1 too few. That is, you have more than you need to defeat a raid, but you are still going to lose when facing a large invasion. And, like I said, it is a common pitfall. I asked a similar question a couple of days ago, and the plurality of viewers went with the weighted average. Now, everyone who answered 5 is not inherently wrong. In their minds, they may be adding extra conditions, like how having 5 might give them a chance against a large invasion. But choosing it just because it is the weighted average is not a good strategy. And, credit to you guys, many of you figured out exactly why the weighted average is a trap. Now, in practice, whether you should actually send 0, 2, or 10 depends on a bunch of things, like how costly the deployments are, how you value each possible outcome, and whether, in practice, deploying 2 meaningfully impacts your ability to weather the storm against a large invasion. For example, if you do not care at all about what happens on the border, or find soldier deployments to be incredibly expensive, then it is possible to justify 0, even though 99% of the time bad things will happen. On the other hand, if you find a successful invasion to be politically backbreaking, then deploying 10 makes sense, even though 76% of the time it will be overkill. Russia's thinking, it seems, fell in the middle. You could not have raids go uncontested. At the same time, though, full-scale assaults were relatively unlikely, and you really wanted to win in the East. And that is the first half of Russia's failure here. The Kremlin poorly estimated these percentages. It turned out that the United States did not really care that Ukraine was planning its own special military operation, especially after Russia started gaming the system and using its side of the border around Kharkiv as a safe haven from which to conduct an offensive. It also turned out that those earlier raids were outright misleading. Ukraine helped the Russian dissidents because doing so was instrumentally useful, not because Ukraine was unwilling to invade on its own. And it turned out that Ukraine had found a way to spare battle-hardened troops defending the front line. Putting everything together, had the Kremlin received better intelligence, then it could have adjusted these percentages and made the right move. But it failed, and the Kursk incursion began. It was the risk that the Kremlin was willing to run given its poorly formed beliefs, and now it was paying the price. Still, that is only half of the story. The other half is in Russia's execution of its defense. In the earlier riddle, we had black and white outcomes. Either you provided sufficient force to defeat the invaders and won, or you skimped out and lost. In practice, you also need to execute. It is possible for 2 troops per kilometer to help in defeating a larger attacking force, but they need to get lucky and not have their surveillance intelligence completely drop the ball. With that in mind, let's discuss how defense along these lines is supposed to work. Now, I will not focus on how to distribute troops along the line given a fixed number of troops chosen. We covered that in a previous video, so check out that one if you are interested. Rather, I want to focus on the order of operations once an attack occurs. The tension between offense and defense is that the defense gets to shape the environment, but the offense gets to pick the location of the attack. In practice, that means that the defender will have relatively few soldiers at the start of the battle, but they can put them inside of trenches and behind other sorts of obstacles. In contrast, the offense can congregate its forces in one location, but it has to fight through all of those fortifications. Putting all of this together, at the time of the attack, the offense has a brief window of opportunity. A good defense is not stationary. Rather, you want to have a mobile secondary that can respond to the specific locations where strikes may occur. Thus, the clock starts ticking as soon as the offensive begins. The goal for the attacker is to break through the initial defenses before the mobile secondary can provide support. The goal for the defender is to use the environment as a force multiplier, stall for time, and wait for help to arrive. This takes us to Russia's second intelligence failure, not recognizing that a serious offensive was about to commence. Remember, the defender faces a window of vulnerability. However, the length of that window is not set in stone. Rather, it depends on the defender's ability to observe the offensive coming and rapidly redeploy those aforementioned mobilized units to the targeted area. Russian intelligence failed in that task here, despite apparently having all of the puzzle pieces in front of it. Now, answering why it failed is a question that would require an introspective investigation by the Russian government itself. And, as a bit of an aside, another thing worth adding is that Russia's response to the Wagner mutiny back in 2023 was also poor, with the convoy getting halfway to Moscow. That case resulted in turnover near the top of the Russian military, albeit for different reasons, but which nevertheless is fueling speculation that Chief of the General Staff Valery Gerasimov may soon lose his job. Yet, at the same time, this is not a chronic problem. Russian troops in Ukraine performed well during Ukraine's 2023 counteroffensive, so good luck trying to square that circle. But in the absence of a complete explanation, here are a couple of starting points. First, the aforementioned disbelief that Ukraine would stage a true offensive would have colored how to interpret such reports that troops were amassing. Yes, maybe we are seeing Ukrainian troops there, but there is no way that this is part of an invasion force, right? And besides, There was virtually nothing in the open source intel to verify what was happening, a testament to Ukraine successfully covering its own social media tracks. Second, perhaps the most charitable reading here is that Russia may have assumed that Ukraine was building a defensive force. When Russia began its 2024 Kharkiv offensive, it also placed the 71st Motorized Rifle Regiment across the border from Sumy. There was an expectation that, if Russia intended to further contest a northern front, Sumy would therefore be the next place to do it. In turn, Ukrainian troop movements there could have just suggested a defensive redeployment. Yet, in retrospect, it may have hidden Ukraine's true offensive intent. The result was a woefully inadequate response from Russia. Ukraine immediately capturing border guards as prisoners of war, blue and yellow troops zooming right past the defensive entrenchments intended to stall for time, never mind attrit Ukrainian forces, and Russia seemingly sending inexperienced troops to counter the battle-hardened Ukrainian invaders that were pulled from the east. This last bit has led to significant mistakes by Russia in mounting its response, including HIMARS devastating a Russian column of vehicles. What we are left with is a situation that looks like a combination of the 2022 Kharkiv counteroffensive and the original Battle of Kyiv. It looks like Kharkiv in the sense that a breakdown in Russian defenses is creating a domino effect, and Kyiv in the sense that Russian troops are trying to come forward, but are falling into Ukrainian traps. For now, though, it is the worst of both worlds for Russia. But whether Ukraine can keep up this tempo is a question for the logistics teams, which, for the time being, remains to be answered. What does not remain to be answered is how this video is going to end. Obviously, it is going to mention my books on the war. Check the video description for more information on them. And if you enjoyed this video, please like, share, and subscribe, and I will see you next time. Take care.